Hey everyone, welcome back to the Quest for the Bestest. It's the podcast where we are trying to look at every Best Picture winner and determine which one is the best. This week, I'm joined, of course, by the usual squad. It's me, Tucker. What? I'm not Tucker. I'm Timo. I'm joined, of course, by Tucker, Abram, Tanner, myself, Timo. We are talking about Gigi, the 1958 film directed by Vincente Minnelli, and wow, it's a musical number. Takes place in France. There's a lot that goes on, and I think it deserves our attention and to talk about it for at least a little while, I think. But first, before we get into that, we've got a little bit of housekeeping. Last week, we talked about Rocky, which got an average score of 8.6 and ended up at number 15th out of our list of 59 movies. If you didn't notice it, this is our 50th episode. That's a lot of episodes. Can't believe we're here. And to celebrate, we're going to talk about this French musical that, well, there are some things to say about this film, for sure. So, we've got a featured comment from Rocky, and I do believe one of you guys is going to take it over and give us the rundown.
I'm here to read yet another top quality comment from our good friend John Tor11, who does comment on Rocky, but disagrees with us on the whole about the film. He says, "I loved your discussion, guys. I will echo Abram and say I have no clue how this won Best Picture. Then unecho and say this movie is not awesome and it does absolutely nothing for me. As a huge sports fan, I am always impressed how Americans always rise to the occasion. I guess that is what this very thin story is about. The underdog living the American dream. But the end result is just super cheesy to me. I would put Rocky at the bottom with 2.0 out of 10 in company with Hamlet. I hope they will fight."
Well, there you go. There's something to be said there about a little thing like called the nature of opinion and perspective. You're allowed to think however you want. And old Jean Tor, well, didn't quite like Rocky as much as the rest of us.
Did you just come up with that just now? That's incredible. That's a really astute observation. Yeah, it's a great phrase.
Okay.
Now, Timo.
Yes, Abram.
Timo, if I may, actually, can I put a second comment in? This is a very special type of comment. This is a text I got from my father, Christian Buhner, who says, "Great Rocky review, thumbs up emoji. Awesome to hear it holds up a generation later from an entertainment point of view."
Wow.
So shout out to my dad.
Absolutely,
he's a big Rocky
does.
fan. He's a big Rocky fan.
There we go. Well, we love hearing from you guys, even if you disagree with us. So drop your thoughts in the comments, as always, especially about Gigi, because I'm sure you had some thoughts while watching it, because I think we did too.
If you've seen it.
And let's just get started. What did you guys think about this movie?
It's a bad movie, isn't it? I really didn't like this one. I thought it really just puts a poor taste in your mouth within like the first 3 minutes of you watching this film, because I have to acknowledge it up top because this is the very first thing that happens. It is, what's his name? Honore something.
Yeah.
Honore, the uncle, the old guy. He's like 60 plus.
Yes.
The opening number of this film is a number titled
Simply
Thank Heaven for Little Girls. Now, if I may, I'd like to read just a few of the lines from this song. "Thank Heaven for Little Girls. They grow up in the most delightful way. Their eyes are so helpless and appealing. I can't resist a joyous urge to say thank heaven for little girls." And
there's also some other line about what would boys do without little girls?
What would little boys do without little girls?
Yes,
and
something along those lines.
It really just sets the tone for how sort of outdated and misguided this entire film is, because I guess it's kind of trying to go for like a My Fair Lady thing, where it's like skewering this high society sort of system of marriage and mistresses and secret affairs and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, like, it just ends up being just as creepy as all of those things. So, bad movie, in my opinion.
Okay.
Here's what I'll say.
Abram?
I think Gigi is kind of Gigi, apologies.
Yeah.
It's kind of emblematic.
Dog, you almost fell into the problem.
It's emblematic what Quest for the Bestest is, because who the hell has heard of this movie, right?
Right.
And so it was very curious for me to watch it, and I think that what this is an uninteresting musical and an unsuccessful satire, because it strikes at both, and I think it kind of hits a foul ball on both accounts.
Yeah.
I had the misfortune of even needing to wake up early. We're on kind of a weird recording schedule right now, so I woke up early this morning to watch Gigi, and believe it or not, I was struggling to keep myself awake, and I will admit that there's probably 20 minutes of this movie that I just fell asleep through. I think that in spite of it being really actually a beautiful film and having some, I think, pretty charismatic performances, it is just bankrupt. This is a bankrupt film, and I really did not enjoy it very much.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to describe it. Tucker and I watched it together last night, and yeah, it's kind of gross. Just like the politics of the story, and when you really get down, when you begin thinking about the ages of the characters in the film, about a third of the way in is when we started thinking about it, and then just the rest of the film, you're like, yeah, she's like 16. This is bad. So that's how a lot of it was viewed by me. I have more comments about specifics of the film, but that is like the big overshadowing point of contention for me with this movie. You just don't do that. Please don't do that in your movies.
Stop making movies like that.
It's interesting that this is the thing that's probably going to stick out most for this entire review is what I think one of you guys used a really good word, which is outdated. This film, I don't necessarily think does anything intentionally strange. It is telling the narrative of a very popular novel, pretty much one for one. They keep the characters' ages the same, and what it's doing is telling the story of what society was like back in the day. These age gaps, the younger marriages, the younger people drinking and falling into high society culture, that did happen. And this movie doesn't treat that with any sort of real weirdness. I know you say that opening song is strange, but I didn't feel it that weird. The uncle Henri, played by Maurice Chevalier, who is a classic guy. He gives a phenomenal performance here. I really think he's awesome. But that opening thing I sort of more saw as him. There were the lines like, what would little boys do with that little girl? So like, oh, that's a little bit strange of a line, but in the end, I didn't see that as creepy, and there certainly are elements looking back where the age gap is creepy, but it is telling a story about how society used to work. And it's different from our modern perspective, but I don't think the film is creepy in itself.
I tend to agree with Tucker on the whole. I think that opening number is funny, and I think that a lot of
it's intended to be comedic.
But what I mean is, sure, there is a comedic tone to the movie, but I think it's funny with our lens, what we're going to back project into the movie, right? Yeah. But ultimately, Gigi is probably legal drinking age in France, which I believe is 16. A lot of this stuff is
and probably legal marrying age for whatever time period this takes place.
16 is the bare minimum for the age of consent. So, but bare minimum is not a good bar for what you should be looking at here.
My thing is, I don't think it's inherently creepy. I think that the uncle character is supposed to be more of an endearing, kind of like a weird uncle character. I think the bigger problem with the film...
He's a wackadoo.
Yeah, the bigger problem with the film, I think, is it has nothing to say about any of this stuff.
Exactly.
And that's why I don't find this movie distasteful. I just find it uninspired in every respect, as I want to get into. When we get into the musical numbers with basically no motion, or we get into the satirical elements, which are effective, few and far between, and the plot just ends up not having any substance to it. And ultimately, that's my problem with it, opposed to the fact, she's 16, Gaston is a creep, the uncle's a creep. But ultimately, I think in the story they're trying to tell, that's not the problem. The lack of the vapid story is the problem.
I definitely agree. I think what this film does really well, and why, honestly, I was having a good time with it for 2/3 of the runtime. I think that first act and the middle act where everyone's sort of coming together and bouncing off one another, there is actually a really, I think, pretty compelling and well done, like, sort of knocking against upper class society and pointing out how ridiculous all the stuff and the choices they make are, and Gigi is fighting against it and just being herself and pointing out these comedic moments. And I think a lot of that does work. Like Timo and I were having some hearty chuckles at this movie, sometimes at its expense, but I think a lot of the time intentionally that they were mocking this culture, and it was like, oh, look how silly and ridiculous this is, and planted in gorgeously designed sets and flamboyant costumes and all this stuff that does contribute to you, like, looking at this high society culture in sort of a ridiculous, flamboyant way. But as you were saying, Abram, the story is very vapid, and that comes across very clearly as you're wrapping it up, and you're like, oh, well, nothing really happened here. And what did happen actually goes against the satire. So I think for a lot of its runtime, it does work with what it's going for. But as it's wrapping up, I kind of just realized, no, the vision here doesn't play out.
One other thing I want to say just quickly, I don't mean to suck up the whole conversation, but it's important to know this film takes place around 1900. So that's also really important context. I don't think the film conveys especially well. It's period oriented, but I don't think the year is spelled out especially explicitly.
No.
But that is also important to contextualize why she is being pretty much groomed for marriage at this age. It is a lens into a very different culture. I think there's much better stories that handle this. My Brilliant Career is an Australian one I've recently read and seen the film for. It's much better than this. But it's important to note that the weirdness is a lot of us projecting back into it and the fact that these characters are creepy. Yes.
Yes.
You talked about satire earlier, and I think there's a specific quote. It's a meme quote, but it phrases my whole opinion about the satire of the movie. In that satire requires a clarity of purpose and target, lest it be mistaken for and contribute to that which intends to criticize. So satire needs to point out what is wrong and then actually criticize it. I don't think this film does that. Pretty much at all. I think it just takes these ideas of this old time and says, this is what happens, and we are just going to let that roll and be okay with it. Even when in 1958, when it was made, those things would have been frowned upon. And the things that happen in the film, the lens, our modern lens looking back at the film from the 1900, the story from 1900 shapes it, but our lens looking at it as a film from 1958 should also shape it, because they could have known that this stuff isn't like right and shouldn't be portrayed as just straight out, I think, is how I think about when I'm watching the movie and thinking about the content of it and how to view it and how do I let that influence my opinion. I think that as a film of a relatively modern era, it could have done a lot more to counter the story that it was, counter the world that it was in, and make it more palatable, because I don't think it's very palatable in the moments when you're like, oh, why is she so young?
I think it is really just an absent-minded, like, poking fun at the era without any real intent, because if they really wanted to skewer this, they would have given, like, Gigi a character arc and, like, screen time comparative to that of Gaston. Gaston is basically the main character of this film. Gigi is shown to us as she's fed up with everyone being obsessed with love, and yet she's childish, she's 16, she's impulsive and things of that nature. And then she starts falling in love with Gaston, and Gaston's like, oh, I can't marry you, you're too childish or whatever. And then she just becomes mature when the story requires her to. She doesn't, like, we don't see her mature because she's barely on screen for, like, the middle chunk of this film, until Gaston comes back into her life. Is like, no, I will marry this 16-year-old, in fact. I don't care what society says. And he has a whole song where he's like, wait a second, no, this 16-year-old is mature for her age. I should marry her. And like,
I want to point out, Tanner, that her only character moment of agency happens off screen when she decides to. Well, first she says no to marrying him, and then she decides off screen, oh, actually I will. That's a moment of agency, but we don't see it. We don't see her thought process about it.
It would seem more effective if we did see that, or any character moment, really, because most of her screen time, she is just being imposed upon by, like, her grandmother, her aunt, Gaston himself. But we never see her have a moment of her own of self-actualization.
I think for me, that doesn't really. So here's the thing. I don't think you need to if you're going to satirize something, I think it needs to be relevant to satirize. There really is no relevancy in satirizing teenage marriage in 1900, because that is basically roundly culturally frowned upon and mostly illegal. I think to that point, in that social system, no, Gigi would not have had any agency over these decisions for the most part. Where I find myself more frustrated by the movie, opposed to Gigi's lack of agency, is the ways that it fails to talk about the still relevant in 1950, but also in 2021, high society cultural elements.
Sure.
About Gaston's relationship to the press and to women and sort of these class divides and cultural differences. I think that's at the heart of the film. That's what motivates the ways that people treat Gigi like an object. That's at the heart of what they're trying to satirize, but that never really goes anywhere. There's jokes about it, sure. There's the bizarre joke about Gaston pushing a girl to suicide.
Yeah.
Which is in a more absurd satirization effective, but in the context of this movie where nothing else reaches that level, it just feels very peculiar, and it's kind of emblematic of how this is hollow satire at best.
Right. My thing is, like, that would work if this was like a dark comedy where we're supposed to hate all the characters, but we're supposed to like cheer for Gaston and Gigi ending up together in the end. So, but like, that doesn't jive with him, like, oh yeah, this is like the third suicide I've caused this month or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
those things don't mix together, and it's absent-minded in its messaging.
Everything that we're talking about here makes me think about another film that I saw recently, which is Jean Renoir's Rules of the Game, which is a early 1900s French high society skewering that succeeds in everything that we're talking about here, to go and say, like, oh, how are we going to show how these rich, wealthy French people are like totally fools and crazy and do weird stuff, and that it's actually bad. And in Renoir's film, it's a tragedy. It ends really, really horribly. But this film doesn't. It conforms, and it says, like, oh, well, it's okay because everyone gets together in the end because of love, and it's self-defeating, I think, towards the end. The ending of the film doesn't inspire me to really, well, it certainly doesn't inspire me to think. And it almost de-incentivizes me to think. I don't want to think about what happened.
No,
the more you think about it, the worse it is.
I do think that the problem I have with the film, and why I was sort of putting a lot of my criticism on that final act and that ending, is that it does seem to sort of contradict itself. Mm-hmm. Right? Or contradict. That's a different word. Contradict itself. For the first parts of the movie, I do feel like it is providing a pretty, petty satire, or a satire of the pettiness of upper class. And even if it's something as out of left field, but clearly intended to be a joke, as them treating a suicide, but not a real suicide, like a upper class suicide, which is like an attempt. Suicide. Yeah. As sort of like just a bit of gossip, which is like really clearly trying to point out the ridiculousness of this culture, and then framing that all through Gigi, who is, for the first half of this film, when she's on screen, a pretty interesting character in that she's, going against this society, and she just wants to be herself, and thinks it's all ridiculous, and this sort of our lens into why this is so crazy. But then she matures off screen, as you said, and just becomes a part of the society, and then the movie ends. And it's like, well, hold the fucking phone. All right, wait, hold on. I thought you were setting up something very different. And they just don't. And I think it's the problem with the follow-through, because I enjoyed the first 2/3 of this movie. I think that outside of the story, which is, a very big part of the movie and why I don't think this is a very good movie, this movie is very well made. The production value here, the costume design, the set design is like 14 out of 10. I don't know how much money went into just making sure everything was ornate in the background and everyone's wearing these 7-foot tall hats with things coming off them and stuff. It's like, holy shit, I can't even tell what's happening here. But it's really visually engaging. I think the performances across the board are really good with the material they're given. I love Maurice Chevalier. I think that Leslie Caron is great as Gigi.
Yes.
Sort of contradicting her really surly grandmother and great aunt, who are great in their roles as well. And Gaston, not as charismatic, but he fills his role. But so you got good performances, you got great costumes, you got great production design, the cinematography is decent. All of this is good. The songs are catchy. The content of them we'll get into. Of course, the choreography is lacking, but there are good elements. I think it's funny in places. But when you talk about the fact that all this good stuff is placed underneath a story that doesn't know where it's going and feels empty at the end, that's why I think this movie really fails.
Yeah, I would like to say, I've been shitting on this movie for most of this review so far, but like Tucker said, I think Leslie Caron is very charismatic. I like her song about how, like, oh, everyone in Paris is obsessed with love, and I don't get it. What are these fucking guys up to? And like her song where she's like sneaking drinks of champagne and stuff. She's very charismatic.
The one with Gaston talking about how everything's boring. Oh, that's actually a really funny song.
Yeah, but most of the characters are just unlikable for the reason of the story being, a bit vapid and like full of terrible people who like we're supposed to think are good people actually. Do we want to talk about the musical sequences? We've been dancing around ironically, we've been dancing around the choreography thing for a while.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Well,
go ahead.
This is the problem with the movie for me, right?
Okay.
Because I think that in the context of a musical, you can kind of redeem a lot with really great musical numbers, ultimately. And while they are all beautifully sung and they do the best to emote with what they can, every song takes place on a bench or sitting in a room by yourself or doing anything to strip the dancing or the choreography or the life out of these numbers. And ultimately, maybe there's something to be said for a more grounded portrayal of the songs or the ways that they're used largely more introspectively in the cases of a lot of the numbers, but it just leads to them feeling very boring, and it leads to the sensation of this. The worst one is when the uncle is just talking with Gaston, and then Gaston leaves and he's sitting like a garden having tea. And the camera sits on him drinking the tea and no sound. He puts down the cup and like waits a second and starts singing. And he just sits there in the chair. And he's like, I'm so glad I'm not young anymore. Which is the lyrics are clever. They're tongue in cheek. I think they're well written songs, but they just give off no energy, no life, and that really, really hurts the entire film.
It's the exact opposite of An American in Paris, which being in
also
a similar
directed by Minnelli.
Yes, and starring Leslie Caron.
Yeah, very similar films in a lot of regards, except The American in Paris has insane dance numbers where they're moving around and moving like crazy, and the camera's moving around.
Gene Kelly, man. Oh yeah,
man. That's largely because we got Gene Kelly on the beat.
Yeah, but we still it highlights the difference of they just sit there, they don't do anything during the musical numbers, and it makes them boring. It makes them actually slow and uninteresting, in my opinion, because I'm just like, I'm listening to the lyrics, but I could close my eyes and be have the same experience.
Yeah, because it really does come down to the auditory experience of them, which is not what film works as. Film works as a combination of auditory and visual elements. So when you watch a musical, even though classically I'm not the musical guy, I really enjoyed Chicago, I like La La Land, I like a couple musicals, and I've sort of learned to appreciate what kind of quality and detail goes into choreography and making these worlds that are absolutely ridiculous because everyone's just bouncing all around the environment, singing their hearts out. I've grown to appreciate that, but even as someone who's not a musical fan, I certainly recognize that songs are good on their own when they're just auditory, but when there's a visual element and you're just sitting there looking at these static shots with very minimal to basic choreography, it's unfortunate that all of this stuff sort of just goes out the window.
Yeah. The closest when you look back at these like mid-century musicals, what we can appreciate is always like, especially if they're like period pieces, is the production design and stuff like that. The closest we get to a production number, a big everyone's here, everyone's dancing number, is like that song in Maxims when they're all sitting there and then everyone will look over at to the side of the screen and watch a new couple walk in. And even then, the pacing is off in that song because there's like a second too much of silence before they start singing again, which is really, really weird. But there's a scene in this movie that takes place in ice rink, and there's multiple allusions to the ice rink and people can't skate, and it's a whole thing. So I'm like, okay, this would be a great set piece for a big musical number, and there's just not. They just sit at a table and sing at each other. It's really, really disappointing and puts this well below even stuff like Oliver, which I wasn't crazy about, but I can respect the choreography and the production that goes into making those big musical numbers. It puts it well below that in my mind.
Yeah. Well, I do want to talk about some of the production that I did like, because Tucker touched on it before. This film is in color, and it is not afraid to let you know that. The apartment that they're in is that bright red. And they have the, outside there's costumes are in purples, dark purples and yellows and greens and all this other stuff that is just really coming across on the film stock, and makes it when we're not in the musical numbers, when the camera isn't locked down, because the camera then becomes fluid and moves around when we're not singing and dancing. It's enjoyable to look at. It's just nice to see all of those beautiful sets that Tucker was talking about, because there are beautifully constructed sets, and there's a lot of location photography. A lot of this film was done in Paris, and you can tell.
Yeah, I think that it's a testament to the quality of the production design and the use of color in this film that makes it still, when you divorce yourself from the fact that this was made when rear projection was much more common, when ADR wasn't quite made all the way, this does look like a modern film. I mean, I don't know what transfer we were watching, because Timo found it on some, not so savory source, but it looked phenomenal. Like, there were some shots here I'm like, easily that could be from a modern film, and you would not be able to tell the difference because they're using silhouette. Oh man, remember that one time where they're shooting at night and there's like fountains in the background? They're using silhouettes of people and carriages. This movie is a visual treat, but I do think it's really interesting that it's not a visual treat during those song sequences.
Right.
Which, to be honest, this is a musical with a lot less musical sequences than your average musical. I mean, if you're going Chicago, which is back-to-back musical numbers, there's a lot of downtime between those in this. And I do think that's to its benefit, because that's when it's the characters are talking to each other most. That's when it's visually it's most interesting. But I was blown away by the cinematography, by the production design, by the use of color especially. I mean, even when it's not those bright reds and yellows and stuff, I believe it's Honoré's apartment where his butler is giving him some sort of face deal. It's like browns and yellows and stuff, and it's a really satisfying, rich color palette that isn't poppy, but it's really clearly designed, and I loved that.
Yeah. If I may, speaking of the cinematography and set design and stuff like that, this film did win both of those Oscars. It in fact won all 9 Oscars it was nominated for, if I can go through them just quickly. It won Best Picture, obviously. Won Best Director for Vincente Minnelli. Best Adapted Screenplay. Best Cinematography. Best Art Direction slash Set Direction. Best Costume Design. Best Editing. And Best Original Song. And Best Musical Score. The Best Original Song was for the title song, Gigi, which... if I can quickly go to a piece of trivia about that song. Okay. It was like mid 1957. They were approaching the deadline for having this title song written, and they didn't have it. They didn't have like a title song for this movie. They didn't have it made.
They procrastinated like us watching Quest movies.
Exactly like that. So the songwriters, Frederick Lowe and Alan J. Lerner, they were at Frederick Lowe's house, and he was just like messing around on the piano. And Alan was in the bathroom, and he started playing like a particular melody on the piano. And apparently, Alan like rushed in with his pants around his ankles. He's like, "That one, that's the melody right there. We have to work with that." So
I mean, interestingly enough, and Timo and I were looking at these last night as well, and thinking, "Holy crap, this thing won 9 Oscars, and it won everything it was nominated for, which is very rare." But when you break down each of those, most of those are very deserved. I mean, it won for the majority in categories that we admit that it did really well in. Production design, costume design, songs. I mean, even the editing and the cinematography and those things are done very well. Adapted screenplay, director, picture, maybe not. But again, that's still only a third of the things that it won. So it is deserving of a lot of this. And I think maybe it's the breadth of things that it won 9 Oscars is why it won Best Picture. I think if you really pull that thread along, even though there are certainly some things that would be more deserving of that if we look retrospectively. But this isn't one where I'm confused as to why it won a lot of things that it did.
Right. Yeah. I would say that, definitely those technical awards are definitely deserved. Maybe editing, not so much. I like I said, I think there's some pacing issues and stuff like that that the film has, especially in musical numbers. But by and large, I can respect the technical prowess that went into making this film.
Yeah, well, Tucker and I were looking at the other films that came out in '58, and well, there's some pretty big ones that we have heard of: Vertigo, Hidden Fortress. So there are some pretty heavy hitters.
Yeah, you got Kurosawa, Hitchcock, and Wells just sitting there. Losing to Minnelli.
Yeah,
Minnelli comes in with his big body musical, and he's like, "I shot this all in Paris, and my characters are all unlikable."
Yeah, so it's, looking back on it, you're always like, okay, Academy, what choices are you making? But the choice they made was for this one, and I can't look past any of the story. The story looms so large in my analysis of the film that while I can give it praise for its not necessarily inventiveness, but it's at least its prettiness and enjoyability in physically watching it, I really can't let it have much more than that in my analysis of the film as a whole.
Yeah,
I think.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead,
I think
Abram.
for me, it's a technically impressive movie. But I think that when this is a show about the Best Picture winners, I expect these to be technically well-made films, and that's kind of the rub for me with movies like Gigi and others that we've discussed, is that you won Best Picture for a reason. You didn't. You're not. By and large, you're not gonna have glaring production mistakes in your movie. It's not going to look like shit. It's not going to sound like shit. It's going to be a well-made movie. So, especially for the sake of a review show about comparisons and contrasting these films, I need that substance. I need that core. And the core is what's lacking. So I can very easily look at this movie and say, yeah, I see why it swept at the Oscars. With Hitchcock and these guys up there, well, then maybe we've got something to talk about there. But just on paper, this movie, those awards, I see it.
Right.
But
well, I think
in our case,
I think that's what I was getting at earlier when I said, we compare this to, other big mid-century musical numbers, period pieces. We've praised the production of all of those. And so I think it is fair to weigh it because it is a positive aspect of the film. But Abram is right in saying that, it's not that impressive because this was a big budget film with a big name director. They could hire professionals to do all these things. So that's a good point, Abram.
Yeah,
I have nothing else to say about Gigi, to be honest.
Any more points? Any more trivia for us, Tanner?
Yeah, I got some other trivia. Leslie Caron, apparently she didn't know that she was going to be dubbed. Her singing was going to be dubbed for this movie, and was present at the recording booth for what was her name? Betty Wand is her singing voice in this. She hated her, by the way. She was like, I fucking hate this lady. She was there to supervise.
That's a staple of this era of musical filmmaking, is them not informing their lead actress that they're going to be dubbed, and subsequently the main actress be like, what the fuck?
She was there to supervise the recording and to make certain that every line would be sung with her intention and motivation. Caron was never pleased with Wand's interpretation. To this day, she said, the childish cuteness of Miss Wand and her artificial French accent hurt my ears.
Well,
there you go.
I mentioned the filming inside of Maxim's, by the way, which is actually one of the most famous restaurants in Paris. Apparently, it was a pain because there's giant mirrors on the walls that Vincente was like, oh, fuck, how are we gonna not see the camera in these? And it's not film lighting inside of there. It's a super old building. So they had all the lighting setups and stuff like that. And people were tripping over cords and wires and stuff like that. There's just a constant flow of people coming in and out. And then they only had it for a couple days. Cause like I said, it is Paris's most famous restaurant. So there was a lot of pressure in that. And those scenes turned out to be fine.
They have a lot of
good
color
for the most part. Yeah. Good for them. So maybe just, and like I said, is largely a positive too. This film was mostly shot on location in Paris, and that comes across. It was a very well made and good on them for actually going to Paris,
as opposed to an American in Paris. Learned his lesson.
Right.
Actually went to Paris to shoot it, and
That's true.
I don't know. They both have their qualities in how they look. So. Unless they end up right next to each other, I don't necessarily want to think about that at this moment. But should we? I kind of sense we're trickling out of talking points. Should we just rank it and figure out, and then maybe that inspires us a little more with some more thoughts?
Sure.
I've got a number in mind. Do you guys have
I've got a number in mind too.
Yeah.
I've got it queued up.
So do I.
Oh my god. I've also got it queued up. Finally.
Okay.
3, 2, 1, go.
Pop.
And would you look at that? That's pretty. Well, it's close.
It's very low.
It's an outlier.
There's an outlier, but we're I don't know, right around where we thought it would be. It is final. The aggregate ranking is going to be a 4.45, which is a 4.5. And the point breakdown, starting from the bottom, Tanner gave it a 3.5, I gave it a 4.0, Abram gave it a 4.1, and Tucker gave it a 6.2. So big jump up there, but still averages out to be 4.5 with our single digit, our single decimal point rating system, and that's going to put it below From Here to Eternity, down there at the bottom of the list.
Good, pushing that one up. Let's go, boys.
And you know what? I will, in hindsight, say maybe I was too hard on From Here to Eternity, and I'm glad it is going below that movie.
That was one of our harshest reviews.
It is. It
Period.
was.
That's a Quest classic for sure.
Yes, a Quest instant classic. But at 45th place, that's where Gigi is ending up.
Gigi.
45th out of 50, so only 5 above the bottom. That's not so good. I agree. Maybe if I haven't warmed up to From Here to Eternity, I can at least agree that this film goes below it.
Although I am a little disappointed because if we look at the two numbers, the two films right below that is The Great Ziegfeld and Oliver,
yes,
which are equally impressive from a production standpoint and actually have like movement and dynamic things done with that production design. So especially with music sequences, Great Ziegfeld is debatable, but Oliver, I can say they have well done choreography and like
the camera moves around.
The camera moves around. It plays into my enjoyment of those musical sequences.
I think both those movies are still more insufferable, but just for different reasons.
Okay.
I'm personally comfortable with the placement of this
movie.
Sure,
yeah, so am I.
Yep.
I think looking at my point breakdown, I think I was probably too harsh on Oliver. Which is weird to say, but I mean that was a fine movie. Like looking back on it, and I do recognize its production value and its choreography and those musical numbers are leagues beyond this. But I didn't find myself as frustrated or annoyed by this movie because I do think, and the reason I have it above half, I think it's an above average film from its production value standpoints. I recognize that the story gets horse dog shit at the end, but for the vast majority of the film, I was enjoying myself. I was laughing along with the jokes. I was basking in the really charismatic performances and really engrossed by the visuals. And from that perspective, this is a good movie. It's not excellent. It's lacking in multiple areas, but I don't think it deserves anything lower. I have it 0.1 points below Great Ziegfeld, which I also think is a little bit too low. But yeah, these are all like sort of in that same vein. But I'm surprised you guys have it like below half. Like I still think this is a good movie.
For me, it comes back to what I was saying before. This is a score I'm giving relative to its peers, right? And I just think that for me, so many of these movies are technically impressive. Great Ziegfeld, especially for its time, is staggering from a production standpoint. But we're removing ourselves from that to an extent by merit of watching it today. And literally today for me and the general
yesterday
today for you
for
guys,
the rest of us.
But I just think that there are certain fundamental elements here that are missing. So many of these films, by being at the top of their years, are richer in terms of characterization and in terms of plot, in terms of theme. And when those are lacking, and especially when we're talking,
this is at the bottom.
Yeah, when we're talking about tenets of the genre, like musical numbers, right? When it starts to fail on those accounts, and contextualized against other Best Pictures, I think for me this is a below average Best Picture winner. Is it a below average movie when I'm talking about, I don't know, Paul Blart's Mall Cop? No. It's actually quite good, but we're not comparing it to that. So for me, that also factors into the score I'm giving. You give a harder score to a college essay than a kindergarten essay. That's where I come at it.
Were Paul Blart Mall Cop to be a Best Picture winner, it would probably be below this film. If I may be so bold as to say that. But
I think that's interesting, and it really comes down to how we each individually choose to rank and rate our films. Because what I do is I rank them on my list, and then I see rating wise, what score that ends up giving it. I have this just below Great Ziegfeld on my personal list, and I don't think it's that worse than Great Ziegfeld. And while it is weak as a Best Picture winner, I still recognize that it's a good film, and I would rather give it its due course for being a well-made film. It's still relative to the tops. Like, the majority of these films are over a 7 or an 8. So when I give it a 6, like, no, that is low for a Best Picture winner. It should be a lot higher than that. But recognizing it for its qualities at a 3 or a 4, I just don't think reflects the content in this film.
Yeah, well, I find the plot objectionable. The just it leaves a horrible taste in my mouth, and I can't excuse the substance of the film, even when there's no substance thematically. The substance of the plot is reprehensible in my mind.
Yeah. And what I would say. Oh, sorry.
And
you can finish, Demo.
Abram, you said something about the genres of the musical the conventions of the musical genre. This film really doesn't do anything in that. I think it does less than average by far in being a musical with its musical numbers just kind of sitting there and not really, I might as well listen to it on the radio as opposed to watch it on the screen. And so that's why it gets pushed down to where it is. Interesting point about Oliver is that I really hated Oliver and I gave it a really low score, and that's partially why it's probably below this film. They would be a lot closer had I not hated it so much.
What I would say is that I often think about like, oh, would I go back and like rewatch this? And I personally found all the characters to be quite unlikable, except for Gigi herself, who gets a disappointingly low amount of screen time and time to be fun in the script and on screen. And like, if I'm going to go back to a film to like watch it for production value and sets like that, I'm gonna go back to something that I also enjoy watching the characters in more and things of that nature.
Yeah,
like,
of course.
Or even something on a grander scale like Ben-Hur, I would go back to definitely before this, because production design isn't something that I weigh a lot in. And I'm like, oh, would I go back to like enjoy this film?
Yep. Okay.
Yes.
Shall we?
I sort of trailed off there. My bad. But
well,
yeah,
we don't quite have a spin this week because next week we will be talking about The Apartment. And so we
that's it.
We've kind of rambled on to the end of the film. Gigi going at place number 45 next week, talking about The Apartment, a little much awaited. We teased it last episode, a little more than teased it, and now we really are going to get to watch it and talk about it. A favorite of many of ours. I've never seen it. I'm really looking forward to go watch it. I think I'm going to get to see it on 35 at a movie theater. Going to go get to see it projected on film before we review it and talk about it on the next episode.
Now, could we possibly delay this to January when the Alamo Draft House near us is showing The Apartment?
Well, maybe we could keep pushing it, just saying, oh, we'll spin again, The Apartment's coming. Yeah. Don't worry, we'll get to it eventually.
We'll sort of gaslight our audience and be like, oh, guys, we'll get there, we'll watch The Apartment eventually, don't worry about it. But no, I'm very excited to get to this one because from all the reports, from one of our very own Tucker Hazel, he says it's snappy, it's Billy Wilder, which he's sort of known for that snappy sort of dialogue. Jack Lemmon, I recently watched Some Like It Hot, and I really enjoyed him in that.
So did I.
And, I'm very excited to go to this one.
Yep, it's going to be a great time. Thank you guys for this great discussion about this average to lackluster movie. And we will catch you guys next time for hopefully something completely different. Peace. The 1958 Best Picture winner, directed by Vincente Milleni, and starring a couple of people.
Not right.
Vincente Minnelli.
Oh,
it's all the same.
some Italian French guy.
Millennial.
Actually, Mario Gabagool, who directed this movie.
Wow.
I think someone does say soprano in this movie, and I looked over at Timo and said Gabagool, but he didn't respond.
No.
Why did that ring my bell so hard?
I don't know.
Boom.
I saw
it wiped my brain. I was like, boom.
Tucker and I said something, and you had the revelation of a lifetime, just like